Kalen's thumb hovered over the detonator, his knuckles white against the scarred metal. Across the sterile clinic floor, Vanya stood paralyzed, her eyes bleeding a terrifying, artificial crimson as the hegemony's activation signal tore through her neural dampeners. "Do it, Kalen," she gasped, her voice a mechanical fracture. "Before I kill you." The silence between a heartbeat and a disaster is where the truth usually hides. If you want to see how this choice echoes across the stars, subscribe to our chronicle and stay for the fallout. We're stepping back now, to the moment the war supposedly ended. 2 weeks earlier, the smell of burnt synthetic coffee had been the only thing occupying Kalen's mind in the Sector 9 processing hub. He sat on a plastic crate, watching a heavy rain of industrial coolant streak the windows of the reparation center. The war had been a jagged, decade-long throat punch, and Kalen felt every year of it in the ache of his reconstructed knee. He wasn't looking for a reward. He was looking for a nap that lasted a century. But the hegemony didn't offer rest. They offered reparations. When the Athelian woman was pushed into the room, she didn't look like a soldier's prize. She looked like a ghost carved from obsidian and starlight. Her movements were unervingly fluid, governed by a silver filament visible at the base of her skull, the neural tether. She stood before him, hands clasped, head bowed at a precise 15-degree angle. "I am Vanya," she said, her voice devoid of resonance. "I am assigned to your household for the duration of the treaty." Kalen didn't look at her file. He looked at the way her fingers trembled, a microstutter that the tether was trying and failing to smooth out. He took her back to his cramped apartment in the shadows of the orbital elevator, a place that smelled of gun oil and old regrets. "That's the bed," Kalen said, gesturing to the only piece of furniture that wasn't a workbench. "It's yours. I'll take the chair." Vanya remained standing by the door, her gaze fixed on a point 3 inches above his shoulder. "My directives require me to remain at standby until summoned for service, Master. I am not your master. The war is over, and I refuse to let it continue inside this apartment." Kalen snapped, the words heavier than he intended. He reached for a chipped ceramic mug, filling it with water from the tap and holding it out to her. Vanya took the mug with a grip so calibrated it looked robotic. She held it, staring at the water as if it were an alien substance, waiting for the command to hydrate. Kalen watched the light from the neon signs outside flicker across her face, realizing with a sinking gut punch that she wasn't just a servant. She was a biological recording device. The realization came in the middle of the third night. Kalen had been watching the data stream on his salvaged comms deck when he noticed the rhythmic pulse coming from Vanya's tether while she slept. It wasn't a life sign. It was an uplink. The Kantari didn't just give us servants. They gave us 3,000 silent spies with a kill switch, Kalen muttered to the empty room. He looked over at Vanya. She was sitting upright on the edge of the bed, her eyes open but vacant, a prisoner in her own skull. The next morning, he took her to see Elias. Elias operated out of a basement beneath a maglev track, his hands stained with the grease of 100 illegal modifications. He didn't look up when they entered, but his sensors chimed at the presence of hegemony tech. "That's a Class 4 tether, Kalen," Elias said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You touch that and the hegemony knows. You try to pull it, and her brain turns into a very expensive soup." Vanya stood over the fallen soldier with his own pulse rifle leveled at his head, her black eyes burning with a fury that her neural implant had spent 15 years trying to drown. If you're ready to witness the moment a shadow finds its teeth, subscribe and follow the rebellion. Now, let's look at the price of that first step. Kalen turned to Vanya. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something behind the obsidian, a question. "Vanya, if we do this, you might lose everything. Your memories, your motor functions. But the link to them, it breaks. You'll be yourself. Whatever is left." Vanya looked at the ceramic mug she still carried, the echo object of her new, confusing life. She looked at Kalen, then at the surgical table. "Freedom isn't the absence of pain. It's the right to choose which burdens are worth carrying," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken without a directive. She climbed onto the table and laid her head down, exposing the silver wire. Begin. The surgery lasted 6 hours, punctuated by the rhythmic, soul-crushing thud of the maglev trains overhead. Kalen sat in the corner, his hands buried in his face, listening to the wet click of Elias's tools against Vanya's spine. Every time she convulsed, the silver filament sparked, sending a sharp, ozone-scented discharge into the room. It was a brutal extraction of a parasitic piece. When it was over, she didn't wake up for 2 days. Kalen stayed, leaning against the cold brick wall, watching her chest rise and fall. He had seen thousands die for the hegemony's expansion, but watching one person struggle to live for herself felt infinitely more taxing. On the 3rd morning, her eyes opened. They weren't crimson. They weren't obsidian. They were a deep, fractured violet, the natural color of an Athelian who had finally stopped recording for a master. "Kalen," she whispered. It wasn't a designation. It was a recognition. They had 3 days of quiet before the world broke again. They spent them in the clinic's small courtyard, where a single stunted tree struggled against the smog. Kalen handed her the ceramic mug, now chipped at the rim, filled with a nutrient broth Elias had scavenged. She held it with both hands, feeling the heat, her fingers no longer stuttering with the tether's interference. "It's quiet," she noted, looking at the gray sky. "I can hear my own thoughts. They're loud." "That's the burden," Kalen replied softly. "You have to listen to them now." The peace shattered when the clinic's comms array screamed to life. A high-frequency burst, a red alpha signal from the hegemony, bypassed the local networks. Across the sector, every Athelian who hadn't been unplugged suddenly stiffened, their pupils dilating into that horrific, killing red. The coup had begun. The gifts had become scalpels. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, boots, heavy and synchronized. Hegemony infiltrators were moving to secure the medical center, likely to reclaim their assets or liquidate the evidence of the illegal surgeries. Kalen pulled his service pistol, the weight of it familiar and loathsome. "Elias, get the others to the crawlspace. Vanya, stay behind me." But Vanya didn't move to the shadows. She looked at the ceramic mug on the crate, then at the pulse rifle leaning against the workbench. The conditioning flared in her mind, a phantom itch of the tether trying to command her to kneel, to wait, to be a prize. She reached out and gripped the rifle. Her knuckles didn't turn white. They turned steady. The door hissed open. 2 soldiers in matte black armor stepped through, their rifles swept toward Kalen. "Sector 9 reclamation. Hand over the Athelian unit." Kalen didn't fire first. Vanya did. The shot was a violet streak of plasma that took the lead soldier in the shoulder, spinning him back into the corridor. She moved with a grace that was no longer fluidly robotic, but jagged and human. She wasn't a programmed weapon anymore. She was a woman protecting her life. And now, in the clinic, under the flickering emergency lights, she stood over the fallen soldier with his own pulse rifle leveled at his head, her eyes burning with a fury that her neural implant had spent 15 years trying to drown. Kalen stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The heat from his palm bled through her thin tunic. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't tell her to kill. He just waited for her to choose. Vanya's finger tightened on the trigger. Then slowly, agonizingly, it relaxed. She lowered the barrel. "I am not what they made me," she said, her voice steady as the mountain air of her lost home. The coup failed within the hour, without the element of surprise from their assassin servants, many of whom had been inspired to resist by the broadcast of Vanya's own defiance. The hegemony's power grab crumbled. The data Kalen had pulled from her tether provided the evidence needed to bring the Kantari before the Galactic Assembly. Months later, the air in the Great Hall of the Assembly was thick with the scent of 1,000 species. Vanya stood at the mahogany podium, no longer a ghost or a slave. She wore the traditional silks of an Athelian leader, her violet eyes scanning the representatives of 100 worlds. Before she spoke, she reached out and placed a ceramic mug on the table in front of her. It was scarred, chipped, and utterly out of place in the grand hall. But as she gripped it, her hand didn't tremble. She took a slow, deliberate sip, a woman who finally knew she belonged at the table. She began to speak, and for the first time in history, the galaxy listened to an Athelian voice that wasn't an echo. Can one act of defiance truly rewrite the laws of an empire? Subscribe to follow the rising tide of the Athelian reclamation. Tomorrow, we witness the first trial of the Kantari.